There's actually no way to tell if we still do. Hold on while I try to get that to work. Okay, I think we are back now. And sadly, we now have another link. So network is bad. And I don't like connecting with my phone because calls might come in. But that's what I have to do now. Okay, so you understand what I mean by short-circuiting logical operators, right? So what you just have to keep in mind is if it is and, this other part will render if this is true. But if it is or, if this is true, this is what we render. So it's more like the opposite of each other, but we are still short-circuiting anyway. So that's that about that. So let's go on to go over bindings once again. Hello. So whenever I say bindings, what I mean basically is just variables. And you remember what we meant by variables the last time. So let me just bring all of these stuffs down. So we talked about a couple of things in terms of naming and so on last week. So let's bring it down. So I talked about the main convention. That is okay. Let me just kind of go over it again. Or can somebody try at least? What variables are and why we use them? Hello?
Variables, according to what you explained last week, sir, you said variables encompasses an object. It's just like an housing that it houses a data. It tells us what the content of a data is, and it can be used anywhere. So if I decide to name a variable, house now, and I can decide to use that variable in any. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can.
Okay, so if I name, maybe if I call a variable and a house now, I can decide to call it at any point as far as it is housing that particular word I want it to house.
Okay, yeah. So that's very accurate, except for the fact that you said with variables you can actually know the kind of data. Just looking at the variable name, you might not be able to know the kind of data it is in JavaScript, except if it is a statically typed language, maybe like what's it called? Maybe for instance like TypeScript, which is more like a subset of superset of JavaScript, or other languages like Java and so on, where before you declare a variable, you have to declare the type of the variable. But JavaScript is dynamically typed. In other words, you can just call it, initialize the variable by, writing the name, then assigning a value to it. So by just inspecting the name of the variable and knowing that a variable exists, you might not necessarily know what kind of value is being stored inside of that variable. I don't know if that makes sense to you. So everything you said is correct, other than the fact that a variable can let us know the kind of data. You don't know the kind of data you have in a variable by just looking at the variable name or inspecting the variable. So that's that about it. And then you can store the value of a string inside of a variable, and later in your program you can decide to change. Am I still breaking? Hello?
No, sir.
Okay, I think that's just you. Okay, so I can decide to store a string inside of a variable now, and then subsequently I can decide to change the value stored inside of that variable to something else, to maybe more like and guys, the reason why I tell you to leave your video on is so that I can know if the network is bad, because if your video is turned off, there's no way for me to tell if you are still on the call, or maybe we are still in sync, because when the video is turned on I can actually see that there's still interaction. Oh Jesus Christ, why must I talk about this thing every time? It shouldn't be so difficult now. You understand? Okay, so that's what variables are basically. So basically, remember what I talked about, that a modern computer, like an average modern computer, will have about 30 billion bits inside of its working memory, and the working memory actually means the RAM, right? And what that means is that you will have a long sequence of bits, and that's a set of binary numbers. So imagine having 30 billion binary numbers, and all of these are stored in the computer's memory. So if you don't have a way of actually storing specific values with specific identifiers such as variable names, whenever initialize a value, it gets lost forever. Having to sort out 30 billion bits to be able to get the value initialized, maybe 10 lines ago in your program, is going to be a lot of work. So variables actually exist so that you can house this value or this data in order to be able to reference them later inside of your code or your program. Does that make sense? So basically, they don't start with the turn them off again. So basically, variables are boxes, with content of different types inside of them. So that's what variables are basically. I think that's the perfect illustration I can use for you at the moment that will actually help you understand. That is, they are basically boxes that you can store different kind of content inside. You can decide to store shoes inside of your box. You can decide to put your clothes inside, or you can decide to add, kind of keep your, your rat inside of it. If you have a pet rat, you can decide to hide it inside and be giving it crumbs of bread and so on every morning. But whatever you store inside of the box, is at your discretion. And then JavaScript. When I say JavaScript is dynamically typed. On a normal day, for statically typed programming languages, you have to include the type of variable you are initializing whenever you initialize a variable. In other words, when you call a variable my name, you have to specify if it is going to be a string or a boolean or a number, or maybe an object or an array, which we have not talked about yet, and we'll talk about it much later in this particular class. Remember, I said we have primitive types and non-primitive types, and I gave you an assignment around primitive and non-primitive types, but you have not done it. So I'm not going to talk about it. I just remembered, so we won't talk about it. So you do the assignment and we'll talk about it. So like I said, so the value you store in it is actually at your discretion. So basically, we can have a content of type X inside of a box of type Z. And what that means is your content is basically a data that has a type, and you are storing it inside of a box that has a name, and that name is how you reference it later inside of your code. So we talked about how to initialize variables. We talked about naming conventions, that is JavaScript variable names shouldn't have space in between. They should be alphanumeric, and you cannot start with a number, but you can start either with a $sign or an underscore, and then a lot of those other things we dealt with. And I also talked about naming conventions in terms of the kind of conventions you can settle for, like camel case and Pascal casing and so on, which you should also research around. I don't want to talk about them at this point in time. And I said there are reserved words in JavaScript, which is also a part of your assignment. That is, there are reserved words like delete, for instance, like catch, or even the word var. Imagine you now wanting to declare a variable. Maybe you are creating a football application. So you decide that you want your variable name. Maybe your variable name is going to hold VAR data. So you say your variable, you initialize the variable and say var equals football is cool. So you can't use var because var is a reserved word. That's how you get to initialize variables. So while we are talking about var in terms of initializing variables, I will quickly talk about some other counterparts of var. So other than var for initializing variables, we also have other things like, and let me just kind of create a comment for that. So we have var, which is basically the primary, legacy JavaScript way of initializing variables. Then we have let, and then we have const. So let and const are actually, keywords for initializing variables that actually came with JavaScript JavaScript 2000 version, I think version 6, ES6 is where we have ECMAScript. So this is ES6, and then I know when you see ES6 there's some sort of confusion, so we just talk about that, and then so this is so just to know if you've been doing your homework. Has anybody ever come across the word ES before? And maybe if the word ES is not clear, the word ECMA. Anybody?
No, sir.
So I've heard about ECMA, but I don't know what it means.
Okay, ECMA basically is an European Computer Manufacturers Association. That it's an abbreviation for that, and you look at it later. I'm not going to repeat it, But what they do basically is they actually create specifications of programming languages in order to be able to facilitate interaction between hardware and software. Do you get the point? Because it is with programming language actually facilitate the interaction between your hardware and your software. So what they do is they standardize, specifications that a language should follow. So JavaScript basically was initially created by the team that created the Netscape Navigator browser. That was as early as I think 1995 or thereabout. So it was afterwards when the language became very popular, the ECMA organization, which is a non-profit organization, took over the development of the language because it became the official language of the web. But JavaScript was not officially an open, it was not an open programming language. It was just the product of a company. They were trying to use it because during the early days of the internet, one of the most important things that you can actually have as a tech company is to be able to have your own browser. So there was this war between Internet Explorer and Netscape Navigator. So there was now a need to be able to allow web designers create features that can actually foster interaction between them and their users. So that was why JavaScript was created. And initially JavaScript was just meant to be a product of Netscape. It's more like a sub-product of their company. And the entire language was created within 10 days because it was more like a very competitive market. And I can't actually remember the name of the guy who created it. It's actually one person. He created JavaScript within 10 days. That's crazy. One man created a language in 10 days. I let that sink in again. He created JavaScript within 10 days, and you might not see that as something big, but as you learn JavaScript, you actually realize that it is actually something big. You might not appreciate that just there, but you appreciate it as you begin to learn the language further. So ECMA took over it, and since then JavaScript was referred to as ECMAScript. So we had ECMAScript 1, which is ES1, we had ES2, we had ES3, and all of this actually came with shifting new features to JavaScript. Then we had ES4, and ES4 never saw the light of the day. It was never released. Then we now had ES5, then ES6, ES7, and every time you also see something like ES next inside of the JavaScript ecosystem. And what it means is that the next specification for features that should be added to the JavaScript languages. And now all of a sudden I don't see any videos again. Okay, so it's more like there's a constant development and different versions of JavaScript. So ES is actually how they refer to these different versions. So you will hardly see anything like JavaScript version 1.1 or so. You always see ES1, ES2, ES, so ES5, is more like, and the thing is that there are actually different kind of syntax that were introduced, or different kind of features that were introduced into the language based on developer experience, what developers expect to see or want to be able to use the language to do. New features will be added. Even as of 2022, there are still features that are already pending to be added to the entire ecosystem. But this is something that has to be carefully curated, because there are things that you probably will add to the language that can actually break a lot of people's application. You get the point? Imagine that your entire company is built with JavaScript, then they created a new specification, so they have to make sure that it is backward compatible. It means that what that means is that even a future release will not break older versions. But what that means is if you have to use maybe like a newer, maybe a product out there, like a library or a package that is built with a newer JavaScript version, you have to then comply to the syntax that particular package specifies. And I know this might be a lot to take in at this point in time, but you understand. But the reason why I actually talked about the whole versions of JavaScript is because I want to let you know that the let and const keyword were never a part of the legacy JavaScript code. It used to be var initially, and there are major differences between this, but on the surface I'm actually going to just let you know what each one of them does. So for instance, last week we declared variables using the word var, and I said var is just telling your program that the next couple of characters that will come will be the variable name, and then you will see an assignment operator. An assignment operator is what we actually use to assign value to a particular variable. So after the assignment operator is going to be the value of the variable. So yeah, let's just call this and the thing is that you should actually Google about it. One of the biggest problems in the world of programming is naming. It is very hard to actually name things, like name variables, name functions, name. you know, and you see a lot you see a lot of funny names when you begin to write programs or read other people's code. You can see things like maybe like testing, message, sending, true. And this is the name of something, maybe like a function in your program, and it's always funny. So they say it's always a naming problem, and that's why whenever you write a program, sometimes one of the most challenging things is which name will I call this? And you must have come across that in maybe somehow when you were writing CSS. What will I call this class? You know, class names too are kind of a big challenge. How do you name a class? So let me just call it Yetunde Jare, you know, that kind of thing, like or maybe my first div or something. Just give it one name, but there are always, you know, naming practices that should help you, you know, go about naming things, that you don't have to think too much about, you know, naming variables. And basically the number one rule is that you name variables in such a way that the name of the variable is intuitive of the thing that the variable will do or the value it's going to hold. You get the point? For instance, now you can have a variable that stores age. You now said my variable, so that we know that you are the one that owns it, so they will not steal it. Abi, you know, no, you can't you can't do that. You know, you have to give names that actually specify what a variable should do or what it should contain, so that when you are reading your program later, you don't have to keep going back to where you define a variable to be sure of the name you called it. So by the time you just look at the variable name, you know that okay, this is this particular variable. So that's that. And I also talked about the rules concerning joining multiple words together. So I said you can use small caps on the first word, then use capital letter on every subsequent word, which is basically referred to as camel casing. So let's just call this what do we call it? Okay, my var. Let's call it my var. So let's say my var is storing a number and the number is 2. So we can also do the same thing, and let's say console.log my var, and then when we save this, we should see that in our, what is this? I hate this thing. Depth is failed to load because of source map. So this is basically not it's not a JavaScript error. It's more like an extension error inside of the browser. It's one of the extensions I have. So just ignore that. So this is what we are looking for. So it says so my var, you can see that we have a variable now. So I can also do the same thing with let, and I can do let is what's it called? My let. Let's just do this, and let's make this 3, and let us console.log my let, and then you will see that we have 2 and 3 inside of the console. So one is coming from index.js line 190, which is this line, and that helps you debug easily because you can actually look at the line of the file where that code is coming from, the output is coming from, as well as when you have errors, you always mostly see where the error is coming from, except if you are using something like a bundler that kind of just minifies your project, and you can't easily, that is what the browser reads, is not the direct file you actually created inside of your project. So but we'll talk more on that maybe at a future time, not maybe, definitely. So you can see that we did the same thing with let, and we still have a variable. Then the other one is const, and then as some of you might have already guessed based on the name, maybe you know what that does already, but so let's call this 5, console.log, and there's no reason for me assigning those numbers. I'm just assigning the number based on what comes to my mind. So we have 2, 3, and 5, and you can see that we have, you know, we can use these variables just anyhow we use, just the way we use any other variable inside of our program. I don't know if that makes sense to you. Hello?
Yes, sir.
And can somebody check if the stream is still open? Somebody check, please.
Yes, it's working.
Okay. Okay, it's working. So that's nice. So we have 3 keywords that we can actually use to initialize variables and then assign values to them. So just to be able to start telling you what the difference is, and one of the most glaring ones is const. And I will just tell you, like, just give you a brief, a brief overview of why const is different from the others. So when you have const, so there's something you can do about a variable. So just like when we have a variable like this, and let me just remove all of this. So we can say var. So it is not a must that whenever you initialize a variable, you have to assign a value to it immediately. You can actually initialize a variable here and say var my var, and you just terminate the line. The variable is already stored inside of the memory of the computer, but there's no value assigned to it yet. So here, if I come here and say console.log my var, you see that it will be undefined. There's no value assigned to it yet. You get, so by default, the value type of undefined is assigned to it. So I can now come down to another line and now say my var, and this time I don't use the var keyword anymore, and I can assign, this is my var. So in this case, let me just assign a string to it, and you can see that we now have that value on it. So it is not a must that where you declare the, or where you initialize the variable is where you must assign the value to it. Do you get the point? But whenever you are reassigning value to a variable, so this is initializing a variable, so we initialize it. So we didn't give any value to it here. So here we what? Can you see? We now assign a value to it on line 190. Does that make sense? Then here we output Does that make sense? Okay. So you can see how this works with var, right? It works nice. And then let also works similarly. So let me just do let. I said I was going to do const, but let me do let. So we can do let my let, and we say, we don't assign any value to it. And we now say my let, equals, and I come downwards, and you must not terminate every line with a semicolon, but it's good practice, so that whenever you use a semicolon, it means that's where your line ends. So I say console.log my let, and I save it. So you see, this is my var, this is my let, and you can see that we initialize the variable on one line, and then we assign the value on another line, and then we output the value on a different line. Does that make sense? But let's take a look at const. So we have const.
Sorry. Hello. Please, you say you have put the variable. What does that really mean? Sorry. I don't really understand properly.
What did you say?
You say you output the variable. Like, what does that really mean? What do you mean you output it?
I don't get what you mean. What do I mean by what?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, you said you output the variable. What do you mean by you output the variable?
Output the variable basically means we console.log it. Because if we don't do console.log, there's no way for us to actually see what our output is in the browser. You get the point?
Okay.
And there are different ways to actually output a value. We can decide to also alert it. We can decide to do that, and it still outputs it. What's that? Okay, there's a problem. So you can see now we have an alert which alerts the value of that variable. But I think it's neat and okay to actually use the console for things like this. You get? So alert is basically if there's something that you want to throw in the face of your users. So that's where you get to use alert. But most times you don't want to use alert like that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So we're going to do const. So I'll say my const and say my const. And remember the other two, we were able to actually declare on one line and redeclare on another line. But you can see const is not allowing us to do that. Right? It shows us a red line, meaning that because this is const, it is a constant. And what a constant means is there's no point, having to reassign and reassign. A constant means it will not change. So you might as well just add that value at this point in time. So you have to add the value straight away. Does that make sense? And everything should work just fine. Does that make sense? Hello.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So const is basically a constant. So for let, so let's just, because the difference between var and let is slightly tricky, but we take a look at that. So let me comment everything out that we've done so far. So basically, let me remove everything basically. So let's declare a variable with var and call it my var, and then not assign any value to it. So you can see that here we can access my var, and the browser does not complain. We don't see any errors. We just get an output of undefined, right? So, but if we do the same thing with let, see what is going to happen. No, not here. So, no, this is what I actually meant to do. So let me put this here. So you can see we have a value here. We have undefined outputted. So, but if I do something like this now, you can see that we actually get an error. And that's because variable, like the var keyword, actually when you create a variable using a var keyword, it gets hoisted in JavaScript. And what hoisting means is that when you declare variables and initialize variables, JavaScript actually takes it to the top of your program. In other words, even though my var keyword was declared on line 180, JavaScript will take the var keyword to the line 1 when it's trying to run the program. It takes all the variables and functions to the top of the program. Do you get the point? So before it starts reading the code, it already has all the memory and everything in the right place. Does that make sense? But for the let keyword, it will declare it within the scope that it will try to use it within the scope it was declared. It will not get hoisted. It will not get taken to the top. So we expect that you should not access the variable before you initialize it. In other words, you have to initialize the variable that you declare with let before you can access it. But for the var keyword, I can initialize the variable anywhere. You get the point? And this is more prone to error. Does that make sense? And some of you might be able to guess why that is more prone to error, because if I can declare my variable name anywhere, it is very possible that I can declare a variable maybe somewhere under my program, and at the top I go on to redeclare it again using, I don't know if you get my point. But and that's why the future versions of JavaScript have to override this legacy feature, and that's why most of the programs or code you will read that are maybe like more recent, maybe from ES20, release of ES 2015, most of them will actually use the let and const keyword as against the var keyword, because the var keyword will actually make your program prone to having bugs and all of those other things. So, but you've seen a simple difference. You can actually declare the variable anywhere with a var keyword, and you can access that variable anywhere in your program, whether before you declare the variable or after you declare the variable. And I said the reason why that is happening is because of the hoisting feature of JavaScript. So you might want to look at hoisting. So you might want to look at the word and read more about it. Hello? Does that make sense? Okay. So basically, that's one major difference between var and let. So the variable var keyword is within is a variable, has a functional scope, and it gets hoisted. Why the let keyword does not get hoisted? Likewise, the const keyword, you cannot also access that. And the const keyword actually has a glaring difference, which is you can't leave it empty. Right? You can't leave the const keyword empty. It has to have a value. But still we get the same problem. You cannot access it before initialization with the const keyword as well. In other words, it doesn't get hoisted. Getting hoisted means JavaScript will take all of the variables you've declared or initialized to the top of the program before it starts reading the program. Do you get the point? Hello? Hello?
So I'm still having trouble understanding this. I don't understand what you mean by taking it to the top.
Okay.
And please, sorry, I think you are going too fast. Maybe I'm trying to pick your words one by one.
Okay, but you understand the situation we are having here, right?
Yes. Just that.
When we use var, we don't get any complaint, and var var doesn't give us any problem whatsoever. We declare the value later, but it still has it has that variable in memory. You get the point? So just like CSS, JavaScript also runs from top to bottom. Do you get the point? But the moment JavaScript gets mounted inside of your browser, what it does first of all, it is sorts the functions and variables and put them at the top of the program. Does that make sense? Hello?
Yeah.
All the variables you've declared and all those things, it knows that now you've declared these variables, it reserves a place for them in memory, in as much as you've not assigned any value to it, but it has reserved a place for them. In my father's house there are many mansions, I go to prepare a place for, it has already reserved a place for, them inside of a program, that kind of thing. So but reserving a place for them means JavaScript just keeps the empty boxes of these variables at the top level of the program. Then it now waits for you to be able to add value to it whenever you see fit in your program. I'm talking about the var keyword. So here on line 118, it can identify that variable because it exists in memory, but that variable has no value, and that's why you see it still says undefined on line 188. But if I come down here and say console.log my var in this case now has a value, because now JavaScript has read line 190 and sees that you've assigned a value to my var. And now when you call for my var again, now it calls that my var instance that already has a value in it. Does that make sense? Not an empty box this time, but a box with a value inside of it. Does it make sense now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that feature that makes JavaScript take the functions and variables to the top of your program, to the beginning, is called hoisting. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
So const and let will not get hoisted. So if I use the const keyword, it will just throw an error at runtime. This is a runtime error. It throws an error that this thing does not exist in memory. Java, no place was prepared for it. It has not given its life to Christ, so there's no place. That kind of thing. It doesn't have a place. But if I should remove this line and do this, our program works just fine. Why? Because the moment I create an initialize a variable and assign a value to it, then is when it gets created inside the memory. And when I read it afterwards, it knows where to find it in memory, and it finds it and renders the value that is inside of it. So if it is for the let keyword, I can still decide to initialize this without an actual value. It will not complain. It will give me undefined. But for const, it will complain. It will need a value. You get the point? It won't work. Missing initializer and declaration const, it has to have a value when you initialize it. Does that make sense? Huh? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we have var my name equals, and this is not equal, so it's not an equality sign. Hope you know that. Hello?
Yes, sir. It's for assignment.
Yeah, it's an assignment operator. It's not. This is equality. This is strict equality, and you understand the difference why we use strict equality, right? It's because
Yes,
of
sir.
one
And the last part.
feature of JavaScript. What's the name of that feature? Okay, let me remind you. I said we have implicit type coercion, right? Isn't that what I said? So if you don't want JavaScript to coerce your type or convert your type in the background, you use strict equality. So let's assign a value. And I say my name is Ololade, and then I can so you can see that here I can actually declare a variable with the same name 2 times. Can you see that? So because JavaScript runs from top to bottom, it actually gets the last instance of that variable being declared. So I declared a variable basically 2 times. And that brings us to another difference between let and cons. For let, I can't do this. Let will not let me. You understand the point? Let won't let me do this. You get the point? Identify has already been declared. But var is very loose. And that's why it had to be updated. Because with this problem now, you can actually declare something without knowing, like 3-4 times in your program. And then you have a bug. You don't get the expected behavior. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
So you can have like
Yes.
10 my names, and then by the time you now type my name, say, it's not giving me what I'm expecting. You get the point. It is because, if you use the var keyword and you don't want to use the var keyword, because most of the things you actually can do with the var keyword, the let keyword actually allows you to do that. Just that the let keyword actually is more strict, and it doesn't allow you commit some kind of native JavaScript blunders that can lead to a lot of errors inside of your code. Do you get the point? So it doesn't let you do this, and this makes sense. You shouldn't be able to declare the same variable. You should be able to reassign value, but you shouldn't be able to redeclare a variable using the same name. And that might, let me just ask you, what do you understand by reassignment and redeclaring? So these are two different things, and it's one of the major differences between let and const. Let and var. So with var, you can redeclare, you can reassign, but with let, you can reassign, but you cannot redeclare. And declare actually sounds like we're in church already, but it's JavaScript. So can anybody kind of just guess what that means? Feel free, please. You don't have to be correct, but I think you'll be correct. Okay, Triumph, I think you should go first.
So I'm maybe struggling to like follow through. That's why I've been quiet.
Why have you
My
not asked
question now-
questions? Why are you struggling to follow through? You should ask. What is the problem?
When I'm in language, because right now I'm here to just follow through.
Did you watch the
Because
replay
I've
of the
not-
last class?
No, I've not been able to watch you. That's why I'm
That's
still
probably one of the
like-
problems. You should be able
Yes.
to watch the replay. Watch the replay every time. If you don't watch the replay,
Okay,
you
sir.
might have a challenge. Some of these things I'm talking about now, like some of them took actually months for me to be able to comprehend them. So you cannot just expect that because we attended a class of 2 hours, it will just stamp on your, brain. It doesn't work like that. You have to be able to, follow through, code along, try to read about it, in a lot of ways. The video itself won't just be enough. After watching videos, you have to read as well. You get the point? Because there's this kind of information you can't get out of a video, like definitive things. For you to be able to understand a term or a concept, you have to be able to read about them. So you don't be the kind of person that will say videos are my thing, I don't like reading. It doesn't work for programmers like that. You have to read too. Videos can help you connect the dots in terms of what you've learned, randomly, maybe definitive things also. Videos can help you apply them, but the concepts in themselves, you have to read to learn them for the most part. So, okay, any other person want to try? Hello? Oh yeah, Precious, I think you should go next. Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
You asked the difference between reassignment and
Redeclare.
redeclaration and redeclare.
Yeah.
Sorry, is it layman form? Is it layman form definition?
Anyone you
Oh,
want to use,
Richard.
whether layman or standing up man.
Pre-assign and pre is before now. Like I think it's to give meaning to something. Like
Okay,
what you do
hold
before
on,
you
please.
give meaning to.
Hold on. I think
Okay.
to create more context. Initialize. Okay, I think let's do this tree. Or did I just complicate it? I try to use this to help, but if it doesn't help, I can remove it. Eh?
Which one? Okay.
But if you use reassignment and reinitialize, then I didn't know we declare.
Okay.
Let me know everything.
Okay. So so to initialize a variable basically is to do something like this. Like I said before, I said if you initialize a variable, it's not a must that you have to assign value to it. So assignment is the process of giving value to a variable. Initialize is you just kind of create an instance of that particular, that particular variable in memory. You probably have not assigned any value to it. Does that make sense? So to initialize it means just
Sorry,
create.
please come again.
To initialize the variable means you create the instance of the variable. You probably have not assigned any value to it. You get the point?
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So assignment is when you now give value to the variable you created. So on the same line, you can initialize and assign, which is what happens when we do something like this.
Yes.
You get? So here
Yes.
I initialized and I assigned straight away. I must not do that. There's no rule that says I must do that. As a matter of fact, there are some parts of your program where you cannot do this, where you don't want to do this. For instance, when you are using a loop, for instance, you might probably want to initialize your variable, maybe an array, so that you can be able to, go over it at various intervals, then be able to add things to it. You get the point. So initializing is creating it in memory and creating an instance of the variable. Assigning is giving value to the variable you initialized. Redeclaring it actually means repeating that process over again.
Okay.
You understand what I'm talking about? So this entire line now is a declaration. You declare because you have so much authority over your text editor. I declare my name. You understand? So that's declaration. You are declared, and declare sounds so cool. So declaring is just a combination of initializing and assigning. So you can see that with the var keyword, we can repeat the same process, right? We can repeat the entire process. So when I said for var, you can redeclare and reassign. You get the point? You see, it makes sense now. Hello. So
Yes,
here I'm
makes
redeclaring
sense.
and reassigning. So let me just break down the steps. So let me see, I'm redeclaring my name, and I say my name, right? What am I doing here? I'm what? Assigning, right? And here, what am I doing?
Yeah.
I'm initializing.
Should I?
You get? So I can now come again
Okay.
and what? And these two processes is what? Declaration
Declaration.
on line, a combination of line 191 and 192. You get the point?
192.
So I can repeat that same process. My
Yes.
name, and I can say my name is what? You get the point?
On the landing.
You understand? So you see that it runs from top to bottom. You get? It runs from top to bottom. So what I will get is going to be the last instance of that declaration. So but let's now try this. So this is var. So let's do the same thing with const, and I think this will be clear, right? So let's do the same thing with let. So with let's declaration, and so let's say my let name equal what's the name I would wish I answered if I didn't answer my name? I don't think of any. So let me say my let name.
Ashake.
So my let name. So you can see we are declaring here, but I can also break down the process and say my let name. You can see that. But for the let variable, I cannot come down and say my let name like I did with var. You can see I already get a red flag. My let name equals you see it doesn't work, right? So for let I cannot redeclare. You understand? But I can reassign. So reassign actually means I can say my let name at another point is what? You get the point? It won't complain. So here, what am I doing here? I'm reassigning. You get? I assign here, right? You get? Hello, initialize. Does that make sense? So here I'm reassigning, but I cannot redeclare. You get the point? So for me to say let with the same variable name can't happen with let. Does that make sense? And neither can it happen with const. You already know that const is stubborn, like it's more like an elephant grass. It wants a value straight away and you cannot change the value. This one is not for const. You can't even reassign. You get the point? You can't redeclare, you can't reassign. Does that make sense? Hello? Okay, let's do that. Are you getting me? Sound like you're breathing deep. So for const, my const there, let's say Ololade Israel, and when I do this, I can't do something like this, for instance, like I was doing before. Maybe like do this and say my const, I can't do this. When I declare, I have to declare fully on one line for const. Why? Because there's no point declaring and initializing late assigning value later, since it won't change. You get the point? So it has to be like this. So you can see another difference. Other than hoisting, you cannot redeclare, you can't reassign for const, and then you cannot you can redeclare for var, you can reassign for var, you can reassign for let, you cannot redeclare for let. Does that make sense? Hello?
Please repeat.
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Please come again, sir.
I say for var, for var, you can redeclare, you can reassign. You get the point? So you can go over the process of initializing, assigning, and reassigning on the same variable name. The point is the same variable name. You get the point? That's for var. It is, you can do anything in terms of the entire chain of assigning, declare the entire chain of declaration, assigning, and initializing. You can repeat that all over again for the same variable. But for let, you cannot redeclare it, but you can assign new values to it at various intervals. So you can see here, we declared the variable, initialized it, we didn't add any value to it. Then on this line, we added value, you understand, by assigning, my let name. Then on this other line, 202, we were able to assign a new value, which is reassigning. Does that make sense? But you remember when we tried to redeclare using a let keyword for the same variable name, it didn't work out. We got an error, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but for const, you can't even do any of those things. A const is a constant. It doesn't change. You don't reassign, you don't redeclare. You don't access it without initializing it. Does that make sense? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So that's that. So I think this is clear enough. And if you have any question, please, you can always ask later. So that's the essence of all of these variables. So at this point in time, let's just deal with the other data types that we didn't talk about. So, and I'll deal with the legacy ones first, then we can now go over the other ones. So just to be sure that we are on the same page. So what's the first data type? Can we just the ones we've learned so far in any order?
Numbers.
Okay.
String.
Pin.
Boolean.
String. Yeah.
And then fourth one.
Null and unassigned.
Undefined.
Undefined. So I said those ones are
Sorry.
empty values.
Empty values, okay.
Right. So today we are going to be looking at additional to. We are going to be looking at objects. We are going to be looking at arrays.
Arrays.
Yeah. So basically, and let's just use console to be able to do all of this. So an object is the first one we'll be looking at. It's more like a JavaScript type that has key value pairs. So it's a more complex kind of data type. And what I mean by that is, this is how you write an object. You put these curly braces around it, and we are going to, when we start creating variables for objects, you will see clearer. So we can say my name. So we can actually store more than one information. So far, we stored only single values inside of variables, right? But in this case, we can actually store more than one value inside of a variable, and that's because we have something like an object. So we can say my name, and I can say something like okay. Then I'll say false. So you can see I'm actually using Boolean values here, you know, and I'm still on one particular, you know, what's it called, on one particular data type, which is an object. So I can come here and save this, and you can see what it looks like inside of mine. So you can see we have, you know, a variable, a data with my name in it and my, you know, my status, and then you can see that. Does that make sense? So that's that about object. You can actually, and on your, if you check your if you should look into Facebook's database and so on, this is how you are represented on any database in the world. You are basically an object, you know, an object that has name, username, email address. This is you on any database in the world. So it's a more complex kind of, you know, data type that can actually store other kinds of data types. So this is an example of a non-primitive data type. You get the point. And the reason why that is a non-primitive data type, I'm not going to mention that, so you find out by yourself. So for an array, here's a sample of an array. So an array is, you know, the difference between an array and an object are actually, you know, there are more than one differences, but the most notable one is the kind of brackets that they use to actually, you know, declare them. So one uses a curly brace, while the other one uses an angle, not an angle bracket, a square bracket. You can see that here. So inside of an array, you can actually store a couple of things too, like strings. Then you can also store numbers. You can store Boolean. You can even store an object inside of it. You get the point. Maybe like name. You get the point. So you can see now that we have an array, and you can see this number here in the console is the number of items you have in your array. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 items inside of your array. So that's what you are seeing here. And when I expand it, you can see this. And then if you see that when I expand these two variables, we are seeing some kind of information that we never included in our code, and that is this prototype. So this prototype is what, you know, one of the things you will find out by the time you look into the subject of primitive and non-primitive data types, which I'm not going to talk about, you know, now until you've done the assignment, and I see that you've done the assignment, then I talk about it in class. So let me know your findings when you start, you know, looking into this non-primitive data type. So an array and an object are non-primitive data types rather. So both of them are non-primitive. So we can go for take a step further to store all of these in you know, a variable. So let's do and let's say user. So let's say this is a user, and then username, and I say jdo, and I say email, and I say jdo@email.com. And you can see I'm separating each. This is a key, this is a value. So the format for object, basically, before I forget that, is that you have an object with a square curly brace. Then you have on the left hand side a key, you know, then you separate it with a colon. then on the other side you have the value for that key. Then if you have multiple key value pair, you separate each one of them with a comma. Then you can have another key, then value. Does that make sense? So this is what they refer to as key value pair. So whenever you hear the word in JavaScript, this is what they refer to. You have a key, you have a value. So with the key, you can access the value, and here's what I mean by that. So declaring this variable, and I say something like verified, and I say false. So this can be a boolean, and I say let's say balance, for instance, and let's say balance is, maybe this user is so rich, he has like 2,000 naira in his account. So here we can now come to our console, you know, and let me just get rid of everything in the console. So we can come to our console, and then and I was going to mention this to you guys you know, during the class, is that whatever browser you use for your development, make sure you don't store so many extensions on it, especially while you are still learning, because it can trigger a lot of misbehavior. So all of these things you are seeing is actually coming from a Chrome extension that I have installed, you know. So you don't normally want to work on a browser that you've already, you know, that you use heavily for your day-to-day browsing. So when you develop, you want to use a separate browser, but Chrome is always the choice browser. And the sad thing is that a lot of people like to use Chrome on day-to-day basis, so you are stuck with Chrome forever. But there are other good options like Mozilla Firefox and so on. So what else? Okay, so I was going to show you something. So the relevance of having key value pair, and that's why they call, you know, JavaScript is one of the languages they refer to as an object-oriented language. And it means, what it means is that everything in JavaScript is almost patterned after a key value pair kind of, you know, relationship. So everything basically is an object in JavaScript, even your functions. So, and you will learn more about that later. So let's just be able to, you know, let's see the relevance of having key value pairs. So I'll just do console log. So for instance, when you are building a real world application, you normally don't want to use every aspect of your user's profile. For instance, sometimes you might just need to display the user's balance, or maybe the username or something like that, or even the email. So because of the key value pair kind of, you know, functionality or key value pair feature in JavaScript, you can actually access the value by referencing the key. And the way you do that is this. So they call this the dot notation, and this is something I will just touch on quickly now, you know, and we'll deal with that much more later. And what that means is that when you have an object like this, you can reference any key inside of that object using a full stop, a dot. So we can now, you know, console.log the username alone and not the entire object by doing something like console.log. We can now say user.username. So that's the dot notation basically. So you can see we have only JDO. I can also go on to say user.email, and you will see the user email will get logged. So you can see, so we access specific things inside of the object just by referencing it. So other than the dot notation, one other thing you are able to do is to reference, what is that? Okay. That should work. Okay, let's leave that. Okay, so basically, so that's the dot notation. So there's something else I was trying to do, so I'll just look at that. I don't want to slow us down. So the other thing you can, you know, the other data type like I talked about is your, let's, you know, so let's say we have more than one user, and that's a very good use case for your array. So let's say users. So we have this, and then we have this square bracket. So we can actually take more than one object or any data type whatsoever and store inside of, you know, your, what's it called, in your array. So let's say this one is a Jendo. So let's say this is jendo@email.com, just to be sure. Then let's copy John Doe as well. So John Doe is just one specific user. So inside of an array, you also separate different values using what? A full stop. And I'm going a little bit complex now because I've already shown you how to store different data types. Like in the examples I show initially, how you store different kinds of data. But here, I'm just showing you storing users. So let me show you this. And then when I console.log this, you actually see that we have two users inside of this array, and the first user is Jane Doe and the second user is John Doe. So we have two of them inside of this, and you can see that the number before the preview of this bracket, the number 2 is actually the number of items inside of your array, which is these users. So this is a users array, this is a user object, and inside the users array we have two users objects, which is Jane and John Doe respectively. Does that make sense? Hello?
Please read about the object and array. It said there are two arrays and there are two objects.
They are what?
Like I want to know which ones are the objects and which one is the array.
Okay, the object basically, whenever you see this curly brace around a data type or maybe a variable or whatever it is, know that that's an object. That's just the primary way to find out. You get the point. But this curly braces will actually be used in a lot of ways in JavaScript, because JavaScript actually uses blocks in their syntax, and the blocks are denoted by curly braces as well. Like when you're writing a function or you're writing a conditional with if, and maybe you are iterating over a couple of things with a loop, so you use this bracket, you this curly braces. But basically what you see of an object is that you have a curly brace that is enclosing key value pairs. Does that make sense? You have a curly brace enclosing key value pairs. That's basically a JavaScript object. So you can also have objects that you assign no value to. You can have items inside of an object that you assign no value to. Sorry, verify this not. So okay, assign no value to, like more like do something like so I think that makes sense. So that works. So you can basically do something like that. So that also works. So but this is the primary syntax. A curly brace, then key value pair inside of it. You can make it as big as you need it to be, depending on the data you need to collect for that particular variable that you're trying to store. Then for the array, you have these square brackets. Then every element inside of it is separated by a comma. So you can also store strings. It's fine. You can store a boolean value like a true or a false. You can even have another array inside of this array. Does that make sense? So you can see we have 5 elements now. So you can see we have the fourth element is an array, and then we have, can you see that? Then we have the third element is string, blah 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 blah. So
okay, I understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Does any other person have a question? Hello? Okay, so here's what I was trying to show you guys. So for what's it called? For objects, so for the user object rather, when I talked about the dot notation, which is basically you just accessing various, so this is the entire object, so more like user.username, and I kind of just keep some quotes, that's why it was throwing an error. So we have username, right? What do we have? So user.username just logs only the username of the user. So another thing you can do is there's something they call bracket notation in JavaScript. So you can also decide to reference the username this way, and it's still going to find it all the same, or reference the email. So this notation is called the bracket notation. Let me just bring it down. While the other one we had before is the dot notation, which is basically just doing user dots. Does that make sense? So we are looking at how to access properties of an object, because these are basically, this key value pairs is basically you accessing the key value pair is basically the property of this object, and that's how this object is distinguished from many other objects. So this is a property of the object, this is another property of the object. So basically just like that. So we are able to access the property of an object. So let me just see. Dot notation and bracket. Does that make sense? So now another question is, how do we access the properties of an array? So for this user's array, let's say we want to return only the first user, or the first item in the array. So it basically might not always be users, but basically whenever you have an array in real life, real life scenarios, you always have an array of identical objects, not an array of different kind of objects. It's not always rational to store strings and different kind of, inside of one array. So basically to be identical, but this is just for the sake of illustration. That's why I stored, to let you know that you can store different kinds of things inside of an array. Does that make sense? So it's not just an array. So inside of an object as well, you can decide to also store an array inside of an object. So let's say this user has friends. You can also decide to do something like Jude, Mary. I've not seen that before. Mazuri. Maybe that's a name in somewhere in India or something. So we have so let's just console or log the entire user. Let me just to show you that. So I'm console.log user. So you will see that we can actually see the array inside of the user now. That the user has friends and he has 2 friends basically. Then you can see the 2 denotes the length of the array, which is the number of people that are friends with the user. So let me just remove that. So that's that. So let me comment this out as well, just to keep our console clean. So here, accessing right. So here, so one of the things you have to understand while trying to access, the elements or the items inside of an array is to understand that the array are 0 index based. Zero index based. And what that means is that when you start counting the elements inside of your array, you don't start from 1, you start from 0. So this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Does that make sense? So in as much as there are 5 elements, but the highest index is going to be 4 because it is 0 index based. So let me just console.log users to show you that. You can see that we have 5 elements in the array from this 1, 2, 3, 4. But you can see that the first one is has a key of 0. I can see that somehow the array itself actually behaves like an object as well, but we'll look at that later. But you can see that we have here is 0, and the key is what? The key here is 0, and then the element is the first element. Then we have the key of 1, and so it starts from 0. So to be able to access the elements of an array, what we do is we use the bracket notation. So we access it using numbers basically. So you can say users at the index of 0, and it is going to restore the very first, it's going to return the very first element, which is Jane Doe. And if you check here, you actually see that Jane Doe is the first in line, so she came first. So you can see that. So that is for the 0 index. So we can also decide to do at the index of 4, which is the last element basically. So you can see that's another array that has 2 elements inside of it. Sorry, 1 element rather inside of it. I said 2. So it just has array, and the array has 2 elements inside of it. So this is it. It has just 1 element. So do you guys understand that now? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So you understand the dot notation, right? So you understand the bracket notation for objects, then the bracket notation for arrays. So there are other ways to actually access objects and properties other than this, but those are kind of more advanced. But this is kind of the basic ones. And you'll be using the dot notation most of the time for your object, except for very rare cases where you have to do something dynamic in terms of having to access certain things, or maybe create some things out of the blue so that your program can, do certain things that you need it to do that. And those are very rare cases, but most of the time you'd be using the dot notation. So that's that about that. So is there any question? I think I asked that before. But okay, maybe is there any questions? Always is somewhat a cliche. Okay. What is it that you are not getting? I think that's a different way to ask the question. If it's fine to ask them, is there anything you're not
It's
getting?
not that we're not.
Eh?
It's not that we're not.
The thing is complex. So it's just like maybe after watching the video again, that's when it's really, really sinking. But
Yeah.
now, just like I'm understanding it, like I'm following you, yes, but it's not sinking in like the way I want it, the way I want it to. Like I don't know, it's complex.
Don't worry, it's going to stick. It's not actually as complex. It will to stick if that's the way everything new actually feels. But it will just takes just
So
spend.
maybe after watching the
Hello?
video to
Eh?
I said maybe after watching the video again, like maybe after check taking the video of the class again, I'll be able to comprehend.
No problem.
But
But
now,
just
all I can just say is more. Some peace.
don't worry, it's going to work out fine actually. So just try. So I was going to go into the subject of functions today, but I think we should stop here. So we've actually covered a lot of ground already. We've covered a lot of ground, and I just need you guys to be able to follow through with the three. This is the fourth class. This is the third one. So the three classes we've had so far, and be able to kind of cover everything we've been able to do. If you have any questions, ask. If something is not clear, just ask in the group. Ask, and then that's the only way you can actually get to understand it, because the kind of work you will do to get the initial understanding of something is actually the hardest work you have to do in terms of getting that thing and to stick. And there's a point where everything just clicks. Like when I was learning JavaScript, one of the biggest questions is how does this thing apply to my HTML and CSS? Like all this console.log, this one. I'm not seeing any. I'm not. You get the point. And that was why, if you remember when we were.
Sean,
Eh?
I said like connection now. You're
Yeah,
saying
yeah.
how does it relate to the
Yeah.
HTML? I'm not seeing any.
Yeah, but you remember the first day we started. One of the things I did was to actually show you some, kind of a small demo of JavaScript and how it will connect with, your HTML. And if you were in that class, you should remember when we changed the background color and did, something when we clicked on a button. You remember that day?
I don't think I was in the
Does
first
anybody
class.
remember?
Yes, when we did the alert, hello word.
Yeah, then we did change the background color. So those are the things you can actually do. But you have to understand the logic first.
Mm.
I didn't just jump. You remember that day you actually saw something like document.get something by blah blah blah. You could see that, you can actually see that that's basically the dot notation I was using. But I understand that document object exists. That's why I was able to use it and reference it. So, but you have to understand the dot notation before you can understand what an object is and how you can access the features available in an object. So, we are going to deal more on that later. So, concerning objects, there's something else about object that we'll learn, and that's going forward. That's methods, because an object stores different kind of data, but there's another kind of data an object stores, and that's functions. But I'm not talking about that now, because we have not learned anything about functions. So when we learn something about functions, then I will let you know how functions actually can get added to an object. And when you add functions to an object as a property like that, what it is referred to as is a method. So in the next class, we are going to be dealing with functions, methods, and the various objects. Sorry, the prototype of the non primitive data types that we are learning. So that's it. So thank you very much, guys. Don't be
Thank you.
overwhelmed. Just try and put in more effort to what you are doing. You've come so far already, and you can do it. Believe in you. Just think about it. And the truth I will always tell you is that you cannot get more than the effort you are putting into it. Your effort will always equal your output. And sometimes your output will even be worse than your effort. So you have to put in a lot of effort. And that initial effort is actually the